To understand how the mighty Japanese Empire was brought to its knees, you do not need to look at the skies over Hiroshima, and you do not need to look at the bloody beaches of Iwo Jima. You simply need to look at a map. In 1941, Imperial Japan was a military paradox. It possessed the world's most efficient fighter plane, the Zero. It possessed the world's largest battleship, the Yamato. Its soldiers were trained with a ferocity that terrified the West. But beneath this armor of steel and samurai spirit lay a fatal geographical weakness. Japan is an island nation with almost no natural resources. It has no oil. It has no rubber. It has very little iron or, for the modern war machine to function, every drop of fuel and every pound of steel had to be imported by sea. The Japanese economy was like a massive, sophisticated factory with a single fragile power cord plugged into the resource-rich islands of Southeast Asia. The architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Yamamoto and the Imperial High Command, understood this. The entire purpose of the war was not to invade America, but to seize the Dutch East Indies and Malaya to secure these resources. They calculated that if they could destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, America would lose the will to fight, and Japan could build an invincible defensive ring around its new shipping lanes. But they made a catastrophic miscalculation. They forgot about the one weapon that could slip underneath their defensive ring. On December 7, 1941, as the smoke was still rising from the burning battleships on Battleship Row, a telegram was sent from Washington, D.C. that would seal the fate of Japan. It came from the Chief of Naval Operations. It was short, brutal, and it changed the moral rules of warfare forever. The order read, "Execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan." For decades, the United States had argued that sinking merchant ships, civilian cargo vessels, was a war crime. In World War I, America had entered the fight precisely because German U-boats were sinking merchant ships without warning. But in the rage following Pearl Harbor, those ethical debates evaporated instantly. The order meant that American submarine captains were no longer required to follow the cruiser rules. They did not have to surface. They did not have to give warnings. They did not have to rescue survivors. If it flew the Japanese flag, it was to be sent to the bottom of the ocean. The weapon chosen for this strangulation strategy was the submarine force, the silent service. At the start of the war, they were a tiny fraction of the Navy, comprising less than 2% of all personnel. But they possessed the perfect tool for the job, the Gado-class submarine. The Gado was a masterpiece of American engineering designed specifically for the vast, terrifying distances of the Pacific. Unlike the German U-boats, which were cramped and short-range, the American subs were fleet submarines. They were large, fast, and heavily armed. They had air conditioning, a necessity in the tropical heat, and huge freezers for fresh food. They could leave Hawaii, patrol the coast of Japan for weeks, and return without refueling. However, the Japanese leadership was blind to this threat. In their Bushido code, the submarine was seen as a cowardly weapon. They believed that warships should fight warships. They assumed the Americans would try to seek out the Imperial Navy for a decisive battle of big guns. Consequently, Japan did not invest in anti-submarine warfare. They didn't organize their cargo ships into convoys. They didn't develop advanced radar or sonar. They sent their precious tankers sailing alone, unguarded, through the open ocean. It was an arrogance born of tradition. They believed their spirit was their shield. As 1942 dawned, the American wolf packs began to slip out of Pearl Harbor. Their captains were young, aggressive, and hungry for revenge. They slipped into the shipping lanes that connected Tokyo to Singapore. They watched through their periscopes as the lifeblood of the empire, oil, rice, and bauxite, floated by in unescorted, slow-moving targets called maris. The Japanese Empire had built an impressive fortress with unbreachable walls, but they had left the back door wide open. And in the dark, deep waters of the Pacific, the Americans were walking right in. The strangulation had begun, and the Achilles heel of the empire was about to be slashed. In 1942, The American submarine force was ready to strangle Japan. They had the brave crews, they had the advanced Gado-class boats, and they had the targets. But they soon discovered a horrifying truth. They had been sent to war with a weapon that didn't work. This is the story of the Mark 14 torpedo, the greatest scandal in the history of the US Navy. The Mark 14 was supposed to be a technological marvel. It was developed in secrecy during the Great Depression, costing $10,000 apiece, a small fortune at the time. Its designers at the Bureau of Ordnance in Newport boasted about its magnetic influence exploder. The theory was brilliant. The torpedo didn't need to hit the ship directly. It would sense the magnetic field of the steel hull, swim underneath the keel, and detonate upward. This would break the enemy ship's back in half, sinking it instantly. But there was one problem. The Bureau of Ordnance had never actually tested it with a real warhead against a real ship. As American captains crept into Japanese waters, the nightmare began. Submarine commanders would execute perfect approaches. They would slip past destroyers, line up a Japanese tanker in their crosshairs, and fire. They would wait for the explosion, but hear only silence. Or worse, they would hear a sickening metallic clang, the sound of a torpedo hitting the steel hull and bouncing off without exploding. The reports flooded back to Pearl Harbor. I fired 4 shots at a cruiser. 0 hits. I hit a freighter dead on. It didn't explode. The frustration was boiling over. These men were risking their lives to penetrate enemy defenses, only to poke the enemy with a stick. But the response from Washington was even more infuriating than the duds. The Bureau of Ordnance, led by admirals who had never heard a shot fired in anger, refused to believe their machine was flawed. They blamed the men. They accused the captains of bad aim. They claimed the crews were maintaining the torpedoes incorrectly. It turned into a war between the sailors and the bureaucrats. The tragic comedy of errors had 3 acts. First, the captains proved the torpedoes were running too deep, sometimes 10 feet deeper than set. The Bureau denied it until Admiral Lockwood, the commander of the submarine force in the Pacific, ran his own tests with fishing nets and proved the bureaucrats wrong. Second, the magnetic exploders were detonating prematurely, alerting the Japanese destroyers before the torpedo even reached the target. Admiral Lockwood ordered his men to disable the fancy magnetic triggers and just go for direct hits. But the third act was the most heartbreaking. Even when set to contact mode, where it should explode on impact, the Mark 14 was useless. The smoking gun came in July 1943, with the USS Tenosa, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit. Daspit encountered a massive 19,000-ton Japanese tanker, the Tonin Maru No. 3. It was a submarine's dream target. The ship was already damaged and sitting dead in the water. Couldn't move. Couldn't fight back. Daspit moved in for the kill. He approached to a perfect range of 800 yards. He fired. Thud. A dud. He checked his settings and fired again. Thud. Another dud. He maneuvered the submarine to a different angle. Thud. In a fit of cold rage, Daspit spent the entire day circling the helpless Japanese ship. He fired 15 torpedoes. All of them hit. None of them exploded. It was a statistical impossibility, yet it was happening. The torpedoes were hitting the ship so perfectly, at such a straight 90-degree angle, that the firing pin was being crushed by the impact before it could ignite the warhead. Daspit saved his last torpedo and brought it back to Pearl Harbor. When the engineers inspected it, the truth was undeniable. The firing mechanism was flawed. The very thing designed to kill the enemy was broken by the impact of hitting them. The scandal of the Mark 14 torpedo meant that for the first 2 years of the war, the US submarine force was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Thousands of tons of Japanese supplies reached the front lines. Supplies that killed Marines on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, simply because of bureaucratic arrogance and a $10,000 piece of junk. The Japanese sailors, hearing the loud clangs against their hulls, thought they were lucky. They began to believe the Americans were incompetent. But they didn't know that back in Pearl Harbor, the Americans were fixing the problem. And when the Mark 14 finally started working in late 1943, the Japanese luck would run out in blood. By the autumn of 1943, the Pacific Ocean had changed. The defective torpedoes that had plagued the American submarine force were finally fixed. The firing pins were crushed no more. The depth settings were calibrated. The silent service was no longer armed with sticks. They were armed with sledgehammers. And just as the weapons began to work, the Americans unveiled a new, terrifying trinity of warfare that would turn the Japanese shipping lanes into a slaughterhouse. Intelligence, radar, and wolf packs. It began in a windowless basement in Pearl Harbor. This was Station Hypo, the home of the codebreakers. Throughout the war, the Japanese Navy and Merchant Marine operated with a fatal flaw. They were creatures of rigid habit. Every day at noon, Japanese captains would radio their positions, their cargo, and their destination to Tokyo. They believed their codes were unbreakable. They were wrong. The Americans were reading their mail. Under the code name Ultra, the US Navy knew exactly where the Japanese convoys were before they even left port. Submarine captains no longer had to patrol endlessly across the vast, empty ocean hoping to get lucky. They were given specific coordinates. They were told, "Go to this point at this time and wait." It was the military equivalent of a hunter knowing exactly which path the deer would walk and at what time. The Japanese ships were sailing into ambushes that had been planned days in advance. But when the Americans arrived at the ambush point, they were no longer alone. For the first years of the war, American submarines operated as lone wolves. But the US Navy had watched how the German U-boats devastated British convoys in the Atlantic, and they adapted. They formed coordinated attack groups, better known as wolf packs. The tactic was simple and brutal. 3 or 4 American submarines would track a single Japanese convoy. They would flank it from different sides. One submarine would surface and attack from the rear, drawing the Japanese escort destroyers away. While the destroyers were distracted chasing the decoy, the other 2 submarines would slip into the middle of the formation and unleash hell. The Japanese escorts were overwhelmed. They simply couldn't hunt 3 submarines at once. The ocean became a chaotic swirl of torpedo wakes and burning oil. And then there was the night. The Japanese Navy prided itself on its night fighting ability. They had the best optical binoculars in the world and lookouts trained to see in the dark. But human eyes, no matter how sharp, cannot compete with physics. The Americans introduced the SJ radar, a surface search radar small enough to fit on a submarine. This was the game changer. An American sub could surface in the pitch black of a moonless night, or in the thick fog of the North Pacific, and see the Japanese ships as clear glowing pips on a green screen from miles away. The Japanese captains would be scanning the horizon, seeing nothing but darkness, feeling safe. Suddenly, a torpedo would tear their ship in half. They never saw the enemy. They never saw the periscope. The Americans were firing based on mathematical data from a radar screen, invisible and deadly. This combination of working torpedoes, broken codes, and radar eyes created a phenomenon the Japanese had never imagined: total vulnerability. By late 1943, the statistics became horrifying. In November alone, US submarines sank 265,000 tons of Japanese shipping. The ocean floor was being paved with the wreckage of the Merchant Marine. The psychological impact on the Japanese crews was devastating. They began to feel that the Americans were ghosts. How did they always know where the convoy was? How could they shoot through the fog? The Japanese high command tried to suppress the news, but the evidence was washing up on the beaches. Crates of supplies, oil slicks that stretched for miles, and the bodies of sailors. The wolf packs were loose, and the water was turning red. The lifeline of the empire was being cut, not by a massive fleet of battleships, but by small, unseen predators hunting in the dark. If 1943 was the year the American submarine force learned to hunt, 1944 was the year they began the slaughter. By this stage of the war, the strategic goal of the United States Navy had shifted. It was no longer about just protecting the fleet or supporting invasions. The goal was now absolute economic strangulation. The orders sent to the submarine captains were cold and precise. Cut the jugular. In the anatomy of the Japanese Empire, the jugular vein was the shipping lane that connected the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies to the factories in Tokyo. And the blood flowing through that vein was oil. Without oil, the war was over. Japan knew it, and the Americans knew it. U.S. Admiral Charles Lockwood issued a new directive to his wolfpacks. The tanker is the prize. Submarine crews were told to ignore destroyers, ignore cargo freighters, and even ignore aircraft carriers if they saw a tanker. They were the high-value targets. The result was a massacre of logistics. In 1944, American submarines turned the South China Sea into a graveyard for the Japanese merchant marine. The statistics are numbing. In that single year, U.S. submarines sank over 2.5 million tons of Japanese shipping. It was a rate of destruction that no nation in history could sustain. The immediate impact was military paralysis. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was reduced to a fleet in being, a fancy naval term for a fleet that exists but cannot move. The mighty battleships Yamato and Musashi, the heaviest surface combatants ever built, were forced to sit idly in port near Singapore. Why? Because there was no fuel to get them back to Japan. They were reduced to floating hotels, tethered to the docks, their massive guns silent because their engines were dry. But the shortage went beyond the ships. The Imperial Air Force began to collapse. Not because they lacked planes, but because they lacked the fuel to train pilots. By 1944, a Japanese student pilot received only a few hours of flight time before being sent into combat. Why? Because the tankers carrying aviation fuel were burning on the bottom of the ocean. This led directly to the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where hundreds of inexperienced Japanese pilots were shot down by Americans who had thousands of hours of training. The submarines had clipped the wings of the Eagle before it even took off. But as the blockade tightened, the horror moved from the military to the civilian population. Japan was not just running out of gas, it was running out of food. Japan relied on imported rice, soy, and sugar to feed its millions. As the Maris, the merchant cargo ships, disappeared one by one, the shelves in Tokyo emptied. The government slashed rations. The average Japanese citizen was surviving on less than 1,500 calories a day. Then 1,000. By 1945, they were mixing sawdust and acorns into their rice just to fill their stomachs. The American submarines were effectively laying siege to an entire country. On the remote islands of the Pacific, the situation was even more nightmarish. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers, stationed on bypassed islands like Rabaul or Truk, waited for supply ships that would never come. They were cut off. They didn't die in bonsai charges. They died of starvation and disease, withering on the vine. Diaries found later on these islands tell grim tales of desperation, eating grass, and eventually, the horror of cannibalism. The American submarine force had achieved something that air power and land armies could not. They had hollowed out the enemy from the inside. By the end of 1944, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was a fiction. The resources were there, the rubber in Malaya, the oil in Borneo, the rice in Thailand, but they might as well have been on the moon. The connection was severed. The Japanese war machine was still dangerous, like a wounded animal, but it was dying of anemia. The American submarines had drained it of its blood, leaving a starving population and a grounded air force to face the final invasion. The Maru was extinct, and with it, the empire's hope of survival. By 1945, the Empire of Japan was not just defeated, it was haunted. To the Japanese sailor, the ocean had transformed from a divine protector into a tomb. While they feared the B-29 bombers that incinerated their cities from the sky, that was a visible terror. You could see the planes, you could hear the sirens, you could run to a bunker. But the American submarine was a different kind of monster. It was the invisible terror. Psychologically, The submarine blockade broke the spirit of the Japanese Navy in a way that no surface battle ever could. Survivors of sunken ships spoke of a paranoia that gripped every crew. Men stopped sleeping below decks. They refused to go into the engine rooms or the cargo holds. They slept on the open upper decks, clinging to their life jackets, terrified that at any moment, the floor beneath them would disintegrate. They knew that out there, in the black water, an American captain was watching them through a periscope, calculating the speed and distance, his finger hovering over the fire button. This fear paralyzed the Japanese military. Destroyers, which were supposed to hunt submarines, became the hunted. In a reversal of the natural order, American submarines began aggressively targeting the very ships sent to kill them. By the end of the war, US subs had sunk 42 Japanese destroyers. The hunters had become the prey. The ultimate symbol of this dominance occurred in November 1944, with the sinking of the Shinano. The Shinano was the sister ship to the Yamato. She was the largest aircraft carrier ever built at that time, an impregnable floating fortress of steel designed to save the empire. She was on her maiden voyage, moving between ports in Japan. She lasted less than 24 hours. The USS Archerfish, a lone American submarine, spotted the behemoth on radar. In a daring night surface attack, the Archerfish fired 4 torpedoes. The massive carrier, the pride of the Japanese Navy, capsized and sank, taking 1,400 men to the bottom. The psychological shock was absolute. If the greatest ship in the world could be destroyed by a single invisible boat in its own home waters, then nothing was safe. The message was clear. The Pacific Ocean belonged. By 1945, the Empire of Japan was not just defeated. It was haunted. To the Japanese sailor, the ocean had transformed from a divine protector into a tomb. While they feared the B-29 bombers that incinerated their cities from the sky, that was a visible terror. You could see the planes, you could hear the sirens, you could run to a bunker. But the American submarine was a different kind of monster. It was the invisible terror. Psychologically, the submarine blockade broke the spirit of the Japanese Navy in a way that no surface battle ever could. Survivors of sunken ships spoke of a paranoia that gripped every crew. Men stopped sleeping below decks. They refused to go into the engine rooms or the cargo holds. They slept on the open upper decks, clinging to their life jackets, terrified that at any moment, the floor beneath them would disintegrate. They knew that out there, in the black water, an American captain was watching them through a periscope, calculating the speed and distance, his finger hovering over the fire button. This fear paralyzed the Japanese military. Destroyers, which were supposed to hunt submarines, became the hunted. In a reversal of the natural order, American submarines began aggressively targeting the very ships sent to kill them. By the end of the war, US subs had sunk 42 Japanese destroyers. The hunters had become the prey. The ultimate symbol of this dominance occurred in November 1944, with the sinking of the Shinano. The Shinano was the sister ship to the Yamato. She was the largest aircraft carrier ever built at that time, an impregnable floating fortress of steel designed to save the empire. She was on her maiden voyage, moving between ports in Japan. She lasted less than 24 hours. The USS Archerfish, a lone American submarine, spotted the behemoth on radar. In a daring night surface attack,